We often talk about single-player content in fighting games, but it's usually not in the most positive light. This side of the game is typically ignored and neglected, offering only the bare minimum. However, there was something about single-player that fighting games have nailed pretty early on. In fact, almost since the very beginning. We are, of course, talking about the boss fights. Chances are, if you played fighting games growing up, you'll have some fond memories of reaching the main bad guy at the end of the arcade mode and then trying to beat him over and over until you figure out the winning strategy. That's what we want to talk about in today's video, the bosses and fighting games. What made them so cool, special and memorable? How did they evolve and change throughout the years? And before we begin, if you end up enjoying the video and want to see more fighting game content, please consider subscribing. Thank you. To begin with, let's start with the roots. Unsurprisingly, the boss fights were there from the start, and it only makes sense. Beat-em-ups were a major influence on fighting games, and those already had boss fights as one of the staples. On a greater scale, you could argue that both were inspired by movies. Classic martial arts cinema always had this format of going through a bunch of grunts before the hero gets to fight their literal boss. At this point in time, the bosses themselves were, for the most part, basic. It was essentially just another character, though often not playable, and their frame data as well as special moves would typically have some advantages in damage, speed or recovery. Even then, most developers knew that these bosses have to be special in some way. For example, the original Mortal Kombat had you face a unique sub-boss before you could fight Shang Tsung, who broke the rules of the game by being every character at once. Street Fighter 2 also did something very interesting with Akuma later on by introducing the concept of a secret boss. Bison was already a menace in SF2, especially with the amount of input reading in that game. However, if you practiced and became exceptionally good, the usual final fight would be replaced with this.
Round 1, fight! Round 1, fight!
Let's consider just how cool that was. You're going up against an already challenging boss, then this guy shows up out of nowhere and kicks his ass like it's nothing. Naturally, trying to beat Akuma was also incredibly difficult, but in a way, it defined the whole era of fighting game boss fights. When people got to the end, that's what they wanted to fight, a CPU opponent that felt like a real threat. Not only does it feel more appropriate for the villain to be strong, but it also provides a satisfying challenge for you to overcome. Fighting these guys might have been frustrating, but finally achieving victory was a real triumph. SNK championed this approach, with their bosses creating a category of their own thanks to how tough they were. In a way, it really helped to turn those bosses into iconic villains, because you got to feel firsthand just how cruel and vicious they are. As we mentioned before, developers tried to make final bosses into something truly special, and one of the main ways of achieving this was by breaking the rules or shattering expectations. Making bosses especially tough does fall under these categories to some extent, but as years went by, more and more fighting games started to get a bit more experimental. This meant going beyond the usual approach of just making the bosses super hard and trying to come up with more unique gimmicks. Aside from Shang Tsung, some of the earliest examples of this come from 1995. Soul Edge and later Tekken would play around with the idea of bosses changing into an entirely different form. Though even if it is an original idea, you could easily trace it back to Akuma. Only a year later, Capcom would innovate the genre once again by taking more inspiration from beat-em-ups. When it comes to bosses, classic arcade games love to end on a climactic showdown against a massive enemy. Capcom's own beat-em-ups like Armored Warriors or Dungeons & Dragons are great examples of this. So when it came to making X-Men vs Street Fighter, it seems like they said, why not do something similar, giving us Apocalypse, a truly gigantic enemy that breaks the limits of character size and goes against any preconceived notions of how fighting game bosses should be designed. Apocalypse served as both a template and an example for future fighting games, showing that breaking the rules is a great way to create more memorable and engaging fights. Some of the more interesting examples of this exist in ArcSys games. In BlazBlue, it almost feels like the game switches to a different genre when you're fighting Take Mikazuchi, and they would reprise a very similar fight in Persona 4 Arena. More recently, Granblue used this approach to recreate some of the cool raids from its source material through the lens of fighting games. And perhaps not entirely connected, but around the same time we saw a middle point between the two, with tough bosses who still resembled traditional characters, but were so big and imposing that they clearly belong in a category of their own. If we look at over 30 years of fighting game boss fights, it's easy to notice that some of the greatest are marked by novelty and innovation, something to make them unique and distinct from everything else, regardless if it's done through difficulty, format, or presentation. However, there is still so much room to explore new things, especially if we see more efforts like Street Fighter's World Tour mode, which opens up new possibilities for combat. Perhaps the new Virtua Fighter will be the game to begin a new trend. After all, the RGG studio is intimately familiar not only with creating great single-player experiences, but also crafting incredibly memorable boss fights. And of course, we're curious to hear about your personal favorite boss fights, or what sort of things you'd like to see in future games. As always, thank you for watching all the way to the end, and see you next time.